Okay, we have our last chapter of our meetings, and the last 4 chapters. So I hope you've read them, because there's always more in those chapters than what I can cover. And there's very nice observations and poetic language that Krishnamurti uses, which I'm not using, mostly using a little bit more logical, streamlined sort of things. And I think that poetic language does add something. I like his poetry. He stopped writing poetry after some years. He used to write poetry when he was young. It was a bit old-fashioned language. I think he was too influenced by the King James version of the Bible. But later on, he didn't feel like he could write poetry. And yet his writing is very poetic when he writes about nature and his descriptions. And even the way when he writes himself, his own teachings, when he's not giving talks, it's very poetic. And he tells stories, like he told one story in one of these chapters about the 2 monks helping this girl cross the river. There's something very beautiful about that. So do read the book itself. We're going to try and see through the main points that he raises. In these chapters, as far as I could tell, basically he treats the subject of thought again, goes back to thought, perhaps in a little more detail, then talks about silence, space, silence and solitude, experience and meditation, and ends up basically with revolution in the religious mind. Now, naturally, Krishnamurti had that objective, right? It's a thematic again, is that teachings structure themselves along those lines. That he started, if we remember right off, saying that humanity has always wanted to reach something, find something beyond thought, something beyond just the self-made systems of beliefs and so on. But for that, thought has to be understood, because thought can also invent the beyond. In fact, it has invented it. It has created an illusion within itself that there's a part of it called me, called the self, called the soul, called the Atman, whatever we want to call it, that is beyond itself. So its longing for that which is beyond has led to its projecting it and creating the illusion of that beyond. But whatever it projects remains within its own field, and therefore there is not a beyond. So for me, I have no hesitation myself in calling Krishnamurti a mystic. Some people have taken me to task for using that word, because apparently in English the word mystic can have the meaning of a fantasist, somebody who sort of invents things and believes them like that. That's not what even our own Christian tradition in the West meant by that, but rather the person, human being, who has access to that other dimension. Call it the sacred, call it whatever you want. He calls it truth, he calls it reality. Sometimes later he calls it something else, the other, the otherness. The other is just to indicate that it's not something that we can recognize, something that we can appropriate within the field of the known. And that's why his inquiry, because you cannot know that thing. The only thing we can do, according to him, is to understand the field of the known, free it from its illusions, so that we can see. That inquiry in itself takes him through the whole field of consciousness, which he understands to be the field of knowledge, of the known, therefore thought, because thought is the response of memory, and all the structures of self-deception that he creates from within, and free it from it through insight, of course. He cannot free anybody or anything through insight. Only insight liberates. Insight means the direct perception of what is inside, right? If one has an insight into something, it means one perceives the truth and the falsehood of it. As far as I'm concerned, basically insight is the operation of intelligence in the field of reality or in just anywhere, right? But mostly in the field of reality. That's how Bohm might have put it And I thought that in the few experiences of insight I've had, if experience is the word, because he's going to question it, that's how it works, right? There's a moment of perception where you don't know where it's coming from, sees through something that was bothering you, and the problem is gone. So freedom is possible, but what is required for that freedom? Freedom is essential for Krishnamurti, right? He started out with that, right? When he's made his famous speech of the truth is a pathless land, dissolving the order of the star, that was a kind of Krishnamurti's basic manifesto. And he stated his purpose, that he wanted to make human beings, he called it man, but anyway, that's the term he used at the time, human beings, unconditionally, absolutely and unconditionally free. So freedom was his purpose, is the purpose of all these great teachers. They are the liberators. They at least intend to liberate, right? He couldn't do it, right? That's the strange mystery of truth, that nobody can do it for us. But of course, their insightful inquiry can help to open our eyes to what is involved, to what is the scope of the inquiry itself, what is the nature of the trap. So that's the prison in which we're caught. And if we're attentive, he trusts that a lot, then we might just be lucky and see. I'm not sure if luck is the word, but there you are. So he starts always with thought, right? And thought being the response of memory, he finds that that is already the fundamental limitation, where being bound to the past, he cannot see anything new. And for him, truth is essentially new, constantly new. And that's why it cannot be known. So it's a peculiar truth, right? That's why I say there's a mystical truth. It is the truth that religion has always sought, that all religious people has always been looking at. Is not a scientific truth. Even scientists, though, need insight to find new truths in the scientific field. Einstein had to have an insight. Newton had an insight. But they had an insight within their own particular field, right? There was a problem they couldn't solve with the known. You see, happens just everywhere in our lives, that we try to answer first any challenge that we meet with the known, and that is inadequate. Sometimes it's adequate enough, right? I need to put this chair over there or whatever. You know, there are some issues in which the known, and that's why we have technology, that's why we have science, that's why we rely on all these things, right? When I was sick some years ago, I went to the doctor, they did all the tests, they did all the analysis, and they said, this is what we suggest would be a good answer. You agree? I said, well, let's get a second opinion. So you get a second opinion, you always get a second opinion. So get a second opinion, and the second opinion said, well, we don't agree with that. We think that that's too much of that. And then they started communicating with each other. My specialist in my hospital with specialists in another hospital who were more specialists than he was. So they started a discussion, and eventually they came up with something that seemed so logical, natural, and sane and healthy that I said, all right, I think this is very good. Thank you very much for being so considerate. And so I underwent a certain operation and everything came all right. So knowledge and the increase of knowledge, because this knowledge didn't come just overnight. It was developed over many, many years. Trial and error, wrong hypothesis, malpractice. For today's standards, there will be malpractice, but for hundreds of years. We had to play with it. You see, we had to go along and find out what is it. It didn't come overnight. Knowledge is cumulative by nature. But Krishnamurti says truth is not cumulative. Truth is a totality that exists in the moment. And that's why he suggests the mind has to be at that same level, because a question of communication, that to communicate, you must be at the same level, at the same time, with the same intensity. It's not only just between us when we use language, like we were talking about yesterday, but it is with reality itself. That for truth to communicate with us, for us to be in touch with truth, we had to be truthful. We had to be at the same level of creative intensity, of timeless emptiness and energy. He talks about energy also, very interesting in this presentation. I mean, presentation, not my presentation, his book. So he talked about energy. You see, that energy suddenly comes in. Why? Well, we're going to see it's very simple. You see, because truth is also a heightened state of energy. It may be energy itself. Right? I recall when he died, you see, he was about to die, he called for a recorder, a tape recorder. He wanted to make his last statement. So he made his last recorded statement. And in there, he said something very peculiar, as far as I was concerned, which was that he said, nobody knows the energy that went through this body. A 12-cylinder engine. He used to like cars, and I think at the time 12-cylinder engines were just the top. But he talked about the body as the vehicle for the energy of intelligence. And it was enormous, tremendous energy. That's why he had pain, because the brain couldn't quite take the intensity of the energy that was coming through. This was his sense that in the cosmic energy can also come through us if we do not bind it to the matter of thought. See, there's an interesting discussion there, which is, he says, thought is matter. Not that matter is against energy. Matter is energy. But it's energy that is caught in a pattern. It's a very interesting definition. Even Bohm was so, of course, if anybody knew something about matter, it was David Bohm. And matter, of course, as you know, nowadays in our modern science, is not such a rigid thing. I think when I hear the word matter, in my mind, I have a picture of a granite boulder. They don't. I don't know what picture they have. They might not even have any picture. They will probably just have a formula on a blackboard, you see, a wave function, which is strictly probabilistic. I have a boulder from my childhood. This is matter. You know, you kick it and it kicks back, meaning action and reaction. This is how we know matter. So he says, thought is matter. And that's why all thinkers are materialists. I found that very interesting. See, because we were talking also with Miles, right? About, he raised this issue of idealism and materialism. At least that's how I interpret it, by the way. We didn't finish that conversation. But there was the sense of, in our philosophy, the materialists and the idealists. And Kay says, no, as long as you're thinking, these are all thinkers, the idealists and the materialists, you're all materialists. The spirit goes beyond the field of thought. That's just the point. And thought can create whatever realities it wants, but that also is what makes it unreliable, right? It can fantasize, it can imagine, it can picture, and therefore have the experiences which it itself has projected out of its own internal demands. K therefore takes issue with experience. It says experience is not the measure of truth, therefore, which is how we take it, right, generally. But he says, what is experience? Which is the ground of thought. Look at it. It's the basis of thought, is memory, experience. When he says, what is thought? The response of memory, knowledge, and experience. Well, those sort of are the same thing. You can make distinctions within it, but essentially the same thing is what ends up in memory as information of fact, supposedly, with a lot of illusion, by the way. So what is experience? And it's very interesting, why would he discard experience, you see? Whereas we are all relying on it, and not just relying on it as the foundation of action, because it gives us the information about facts, establishes the reality, what is actual, what is not actual, right? But also we want experience because somehow internally we depend on it to feel that we are achieving, and that we're coming to something. So experience is kind of our way through the world in terms of knowledge and in terms of becoming, the word I keep using because he uses it a lot. I want, therefore, to have the experience of truth, the experience of God, whatever we want to call it. And he says that experience is just a projection of a desire. And if you actually see God, it will be the one that you have, from your background, you have yourself projected. And you recognize them as such. And therefore, it is in the known and within the known that experience exists. So he says, but therefore, you can't see anything new. You cannot really experience anything new, because to experience anything, you must recognize it. And therefore is already falling back into the old pattern. He told us once this anecdote about himself, because he was very psychic. And he said, I used to see the Buddha. And we said, oh, fantastic. We were all very enthusiastic. I would like to see the Buddha too. So, Christ or whoever you want to see. So, but Buddha just said, he could see the Buddha. So he said, one day the Buddha appeared in my room. So I said, I'm going to test whether it's real or not. So I walked right through him, and he never appeared again. I said, what? I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't let him be there. It's just so fantastic. The company of the Buddha. No. Okay, he was so drastic. He was not standing for all these spiritual appearances. He tested whether it was real or not, walked through it, and the Buddha disappeared. So he was questioning all the time this ability of the mind to trick itself into having seemingly transcendental experiences, which he feels are just projections from his own background. Now, mind you, he saw all kinds of things which for him were real, and he never talked about that. But that's because he felt that those visions or whatever were not relevant, strictly relevant. That what is relevant is the self-knowledge, the freedom from the factors of self-deception, and conflict, because that's where we waste our energy, and therefore the gathering of all that energy for the insight into the whole meaning of consciousness, so that it comes to order. That's what he called religion. It was very interesting how he defined religion. He looked at the word religion, and as you know, people are discussing still what is the actual etymology of it, but they trace it to Latin, essentially, religare, and re just means to do again, or back, and ligare is to bind, a ligature, that you even have it in English as well, is like a ligature. So you tie something back together. So the idea normally is that we've been split from ourselves, from our origins, from the goodness of the universe, or whatever, the sacred, and therefore religion is the attempt to bring those together. Apparently the word yoga has a similar meaning, because it comes from yoke, what you put on the cattle to pull the cart. So it's yoking it together, bringing us together in sync with what is wholly transcendental. So that's the meaning of religion. But he says, no, religion is the gathering of all energy. So what are you really gathering? What are you binding back together? Is energy. That we need energy in order to perceive. We need energy for everything anyway, right? We need energy for walking, getting up in the morning and talking, and everything is energy, right? He says we need that energy, psychological energy, in order, or whatever I'm not sure is psychological, is energy, in order for that insight, total insight into the nature of the psyche itself. Now they go together, right? Because we won't gather that energy unless we understand consciousness and how it fragments itself, enters into conflict, creates its own self-delusions, creates its own internal friction, wastes energy. That's why we don't have passion, he says. We're not passionate, because the passion is energy, the intensity that gathers, say, behind a question, because we're afraid, for example, of passion itself, because it overwhelms us, and we are afraid to be overwhelmed. It's also true, isn't it? We're afraid to sort of just let go. It's all a matter of control. We're under control. Everybody's controlling, keeping it all within measure. Measurement becomes our sense of order and our sense of well-being. But measure is actually, in the field of consciousness, becomes its own limitation. It is thought, keeping its own parameters, keeping us within its own parameters. That is his own denial of passion. I'm not sure, but I think there's something to that, no? He says, do we ever ask a question with real passion? A fundamental question, because the answer you get will depend on the intensity of passion. And the solution to any problem depends on the quality of energy you bring to bear on it. which is the intensity of attention. They're all the same. The quality of attention, the intensity of energy, right? Which is what solves these problems. That's the energy of insight. You see, like insight is like a laser beam, which is very concentrated energy. So I don't know anything about lasers, but it's a concentrated energy. It's like a flash, and can see through. This is the nature of insight, right? It's a flash, and that needs energy. But that means understanding thought, understanding its limitations, how it creates that binds us to time, and therefore creates this self-defeating movement within its own limited domain. I mean by that it's sort of bound by itself, is self-referential, and then creates the illusion of something beyond, but it remains within itself. Besides, it's caught in the opposites. It's caught in contradiction. That's what he says, right? Thought seeks happiness, seeks pleasure, and does not realize that is inviting pain. We want peace, but meanwhile, we take pleasure in violence. Right? We want security, but we divide ourselves from others so that we make sure that there is conflict and war and all kinds of things, right? So that kind of contradictory thought seems to be moving, and then he says, I must be good, right? But in the very desire to be good, it has evil already defined, so that our life seems to be within the field of thought, confined to what Krishnamurti called the corridor of the opposites. Now, the corridor of the opposites, I know it very well from my own background as a Catholic, as a Christian, probably anywhere, you're brought up to walk through this narrow corridor of the opposites, the virtues on one side and the vices on the other. Sins, right? Some more deadly than others. So there you are, caught between those two, morally, ethically, in the corridor of the opposites. But that's conflict and therefore wastage of energy, whereas religion is the gathering of energy. So once again, he sees a contradiction in the very religious movement that we have created for ourselves, and that is the end of freedom. So what is he appealing to then, right? So he said, we are not alone. So he goes this is very mystical path. Those of you who may be aware of some of that, see, like in Spain, we had to read St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila, because they were literary figures. They wrote beautiful poems. When you went to high school, you studied Spanish literature, and you ended up reading their poems. But of course, they could write love poems. You could take it normally like a love poem, but it wasn't a love poem. It was a love poem, but the love was something else. It was communicating a mystical encounter, right? That's also how Krishnamurti was initially in his youth, very much along the lines of these guys, because they took a very strange book in the Bible that doesn't seem to belong there, which is a Song of Songs. It's a love poem. What's it doing? A very sensuous love poem. Well, Krishnamurti knew it by heart. Now, he had the typical mystical interpretation that this is the love that has to be beloved. He used to talk about the lover and the beloved. The beloved is what is beyond, right? Is the sacred. So that's what you are in love with, really. So that's how they translated that poem mystically in that way. And that's how St. John of the Cross wrote about it as a very beautiful poem called The Dark Night of the Soul, in which that's what it's actually about. You have to go through your own dark night. But of course, you can only find your way if love is burning in your heart. And then there is the mystical union, right, with the sacred. So there was Krishnamurti. He says, for that, you must be alone. And we are seldom alone. But what he means by alone is empty of everything you are psychologically. What he calls meditation, that's where meditation comes in. See what the Christians call contemplation. I'm just going to draw a parallel. That is, that Christians would say, good old St. John of the Cross, he said, all right, the mystical way, there are three, the via mystica, the mystical way has three ways. One is the via purgativa. You must, is a purgation, the way of purgation, which means freedom from those factors of cultivation and conflict at the end of the day. They call it sin, they call it anything, but they talk about the same similar things. Your arrogance, your lust, your pride, your aggression, your greed, your violence, right? Your deception, your lies. Can you understand that and be free from it? Because they did it with the corridor of opposites, but that doesn't work, right? So something else has to come in. Via purgativa, and then via contemplativa, which is the state of contemplation. Kay didn't like the word contemplation for some reason. He preferred the word meditation. He had always, therefore, a difficulty with that word, because the word meditation has an etymological meaning, which means measure. Etymologically means measure. And for Krishnamurti, meditation is not measure, right? Not measure at all, because it has to do with pondering, with thinking. You see, the Christians also use meditation. Meditate on your sins. So they went and picked up Christ, and they started talking about Christ. And they started meditating that way, right? But that's not what Krishnamurti means by meditation. It's something else. Meditation is begins with choiceless awareness of what is, so that already you begin with non-duality, because the duality is created by the judgment, right? By the choice one makes, the condemnation, rejection, identification. He says, don't start there. That's already the beginning of, you go in the wrong way. The first step is the last step, he always said, right? Therefore, what's the first step? No choice. Can you do that? Can you be aware of whatever it is? You see, meditation is the state of awareness of thought and feeling as they happen without judgment. So it is choiceless awareness that's happening here. It's not concentration, it's not repeating of mantras, it's not absorption in a picture or an object. What is not? I mean, there's not a method, not a system. He discarded all that somehow, even though he told a little bit that there are certain things you can do, in fact, that are conducive to that state of awareness. No, if you read, I was surprised, and some Krishnamurti people have a difficulty considering that Krishnamurti might have had a system of meditation. But he taught it to us kids at Brookwood Park. Now, I may have not been very diligent, not practicing it. See, because he said there's no practice. So I think there was a little contradiction somewhere in there that needs to be resolved still. Because he said, sit quietly with your back straight so that the blood can circulate to your brain. Wait a minute. Who cares? Right? If there is no method, no technique, what should the blood do? Because your brain has to be properly oxygenated. And fix your eyeballs. What? This is technique, right? In a way. Why would you fix your eyeballs? Because there was a because. Because the eyeballs are very directly connected with thought. If the eyeball moves, then that moves thought, and vice versa. If you fix the eyeballs, then you have already you diminish the excitement, the incitement to thought. See, he was doing all sorts of things, knew all kinds of things, and he told us to experiment with it. Fix your, and then pay attention to your body. Because your body is very important, that the body be completely relaxed. Now, every meditation people, they say this, the Buddhists particularly, they all are keen on this. So quiet. And if you feel some itching, don't try to control it. Don't control, just pay attention. So it was not control. He dismissed control, concentration, repetition of words. It's just attention to what is. But at the same time, he said there are things you can do if you want to experiment with this. There's just some indications as to proper experimentation for yourself. And then he said you pay attention to thought, to your consciousness. Now, that's a mess. One thing after another, my shoes, sex, food, clothes and shelter, and whatever else, mathematics and physics. Whatever is there is a jumble. Everybody's consciousness is just chaotic. It's true, it's very true. You don't even know what you're thinking. And when you discover what you're thinking, you say, why am I thinking that? Or who's thinking anyway? It just goes on by itself. It's by layers, layers of disorder. So you say, all right, just pay attention. Again, no choice, no good or bad, just the movement of thought, as I was describing the other day, also in another meeting with us, between us, of that sense of just let the movement be without judgment, understand it. He sometimes used to say, become aware of your thoughts and ask yourself also why, right? Why is that happening? What's the origin? Because in this set of chapters, he asked a very interesting question, which I had not heard him asking oftentimes, which is we're trying to find out what is the origin of thought. Why would that be important? And for him, it seems in the description that to find out the origin of thought is part of discovering the way of non-contradiction psychologically. Why would that be? See, is it that we are in contradiction because we are not aware how thought arises, why it arises, what's its origin, and therefore we're not aware also of its movement. See, when he discusses understanding anything, be it fears, thought, anything, he talks about understanding its nature, meaning its origin, its structure, how it is put together, and its movement, how it goes on or proceeds. So this is his way of understanding any psychological movement, its nature, structure, and movement. I said, why is he stuck? So then he's doing the same to thought. I think most of us have never really thought about that. What is the nature, structure, and movement of thought? So the first one is the nature, the origin. Where does it come from? Now, he seemed to have answered it by saying it comes from memory. But then you have to ask, what is memory? And what's the origin of memory also? Because memory is for him also the result. It's like it builds upon itself. The moment there is memory, a recording is recording. And what memory is necessary? See, he points the question right at the beginning. We're going to find out what is logical, sane thought and what is thought that has no meaning. And for him, psychological thought has no meaning. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. This is the poor old Shakespearean tragedy. So there you have it, but he's looking at that, right? All the noise, he says, is coming from unnecessary memory. So we have to find out how come this memory has also become so important to us. Why we keep recording what is not necessary to record. And that the moment it is recorded, then it keeps feeding. Thought is just the mechanical response of that memory. So we have to go even beyond thought, if you like, or to the root of thought to understand why that is happening, right? So that's not so easy. I don't know that I've ever come to the origin and root of thought, that to see how it arises. Why do I recall? Why do we recall our hurts? See, this is very strong memories. And then they shape our lives, and we just cannot get rid of them. And thought, thinking about them, cannot get rid of them, cannot solve these psychological problems, because the root of them is in the memory itself. So you have to go to the memory and perceive the memory as memory, and maybe then, as the emotion that it contains blooms, be free from it. Perhaps. I'm just putting that forward, because this raised that question for me, these chapters. It's one of the questions that right in the chapter 13 is raised for me, and I couldn't answer it properly. So I have to leave it there as a question mark to discover, and also in life, to find out what's the real source of it. But Krishnamurti says, well, that we have to do, otherwise there's no real silence, right? And silence is what concerns him. To find a space, not the space between the observer and the observed, which he wants to dissolve, because that's the space of distance and friction, and therefore a wastage of energy, of fragmentation, but the space in which nothing exists. in which there is the absence of thought, not forced, but through understanding. It had a very beautiful memory. Had to come upon it, to have this emptiness of the mind, the cleanness of the inner world, the purity, the innocence. He talks about innocence. Interesting, no? I thought that word is very precious to him because it means that which is not hurt, that which cannot be hurt, the innocent. But that which is not hurt is therefore that which is not divided or in conflict. Therefore, is freedom from the self-centered movement of consciousness. Right? That is innocence. And he says only the innocent can see what is true. The innocent is also the state of emptiness, and he calls it also solitude, aloneness, silence. He uses different words, right, for it. And of course, that's the movement of meditation, because he defined it, the emptying of consciousness of all its content, and that becomes key to the awakening of the religious mind, because our religious mind is the same as meditation, except that now it has the characteristic of an intense quality of energy. It can see through the whole, whatever remnants of consciousness there may be, because we're already practically beyond it. The question of sequence, I lose it at a certain point in his descriptions. What comes first, what comes second. But there it is, this movement of meditation, he called it a movement, to the perception of what is, the staying with what is without choice, begins to clear the whole turbulence of consciousness, the self-occupation, empties it of its content. That's the key meaning he gave to the word meditation, the emptying of consciousness of its content. That, of course, because the content is no longer in this dualistic structure, which is the nature of it, there is energy, and that energy can break through to some insight into the nature of truth, or can receive truth. We'll see. But very interestingly, he has one passage there, which I found baffling and yet insightful, which was, you could say, if I'm free from my dualities of the observer and the observed, thinker and thought, all those struggles of everyday life, then I'll be free also from content. Because what is content? A lot of the content is just the memory of the unresolved issues that we have in life. That's why consciousness perhaps keeps itself busy all the time. Because one, as I respond to the new with memory, I created a problem. The memory cannot answer the challenge adequately, and therefore it remembers it. It feeds back on itself. It has to remember it because it's unresolved. And what is the mind or the brain busy with? Trying to resolve its problems. The problems it itself has created with its inadequate responses. So memory builds up to an enormous momentum. Look at the momentum that it has. Memory and conflict. They build and build on each other, and that's why these conflicts cannot be resolved. And I suddenly came up with this thought, why are these conflicts not solved? And he was offering, in my view, one way to understand that, perhaps. I offer it only hypothetically from what I was reading, which is the inadequacy of the response of the past to the present challenge, which is new, is what creates our problems. Because it is a problem, we record it as such and build more on the memory in order to respond further on. But because the memory will inevitably be inadequate to the challenge, it will never solve the problem. The only thing he can do is to realize the futility of that whole movement, and therefore open up to a new perception, to the real perception of what is there in front of his own eyes. The human problem is a problem of misperception due to the projection from the past. That's why he wants to end time, wants to empty consciousness of its content, which is the known. What is consciousness then? We don't know. and there he goes, you see, emphasizing, therefore, this quality of emptiness, silence, solitude, in the sense he understands it. We are alone, all one, when we are empty of ourselves. When consciousness is totally empty of itself, it has order, it has beauty. love and truth, he says. Well, lovely. But we'll see, we'll see. Those are just the words that he uses, right? And as he doesn't talk about, he talks a little about religion sometimes somewhere, but he doesn't like to talk about religion because that becomes a noun and it becomes a kind of institution per se, but rather the religious mind. He doesn't want to go anywhere outside the field of the mind in terms of these qualities. So the religious mind is what he's talking about, which is that state of insight, energy, non-duality at all, where freedom and wholeness for humanity exists, and in whose emptiness there can be maybe the encounter with the other, with the beloved,